in the hours of night, in a house of prayer, one is able to quietly enter into the mystery of the passage of time. Being alone with the angels, one somehow sees things not in the immediacy of what actually detracts from the mystery of time, but in their depth. And I'd like to share with you a few thoughts as we pass from one ear to the other. They're contained actually in the first reading. We have the way in which the humanity, the tenderness, the salvation of our God has appeared unto man, but we're asked to do certain things. And this is what I'd like to dwell on for a few seconds. The way we actually handle the gift of time. The soul is its own worst enemy. And the apostle is giving here Titus, but through him us, certain tips. What can actually help us to live well this innings that actually is not that long. We've all tried to get rid of baggage, so we can take that first bit. Once we have rejected godlessness, he talks about here godlessness, remember where they're coming from, these pagans, and worldly lusts. So desire and all that goes with it is one enemy that we should jettison, otherwise there's no peace. Passion obnubilates calm reason. We don't behave well either under passion or under tension. Tension est mauvaise conseillère. Tension is a bad counsellor. Look at your reactions under tension. And then the positive. To live a life of, now here translated, self-control. So that's one thing we can look at for a second as we begin this year. Am I in control? Or am I being controlled? There are a few practical issues which we can look at on that one. One is the whole secret of knowing how, within the parameters of the time that we have, not to be fighting against time. Because we have, to some extent, a choice. I'll try and explain what I mean. If we're not careful, all our time on earth can be spent in fighting the clock. And it's partly, not entirely, but partly our own fault. Why? Because we have in our mind to do certain things and by a certain time, okay, but then we add to them. We first of all give ourselves deadlines which are actually not really there. We can do calmly one thing at a time, even if it takes a day longer. But the other is this. If we're honest with ourselves, a lot of this goes on also. We squeeze the time available into smaller spaces. Why? We do things which actually we don't need to do and which are very absorbing in the parameters of time that's there, e.g., to be concrete. Is it or is it not interesting to go into, for instance, now, a justifiably interesting, educative YouTube, okay, but are we in control of what happens after? That's the big one. Now, what could be happening to a lot of us who are young is this. We're actually not seeing that the calmness of our time is going into the fact that for a while, a bigger while each time, we're glued into something that we have at all costs to see the end of, and what's going to happen? The parameters of the time that was given us, which were actually quite generous, are squeezed into smaller spaces, and so then the consequences are rushing against the clock and anxiety in the mind. Now, going back to those calm years in the purely enclosed monastic life, none of that was actually there. Why? 1, no conversation. That's a huge gainer of time. 2, no telephones. That's a huge liberating force. 3, no television or anything resembling it in those days. That is actually a massive giver of time. Now, do you see the huge way in which that gives an interior freedom compared with what actually for a lot of us will be this next year? Pressure and anxiety, damaging actually our psychology and our soul. It's all linked because psyche, which gives us the word psychology, is soul. And so there are practical things which will give us freedom and therefore a certain mode of peace. Time is given sufficiently abundantly if we use it for what it was meant for. Also, the question of how many good conversations start well but don't know where to stop, become damaging, and also have the same effect of cancelling big chunks of time. Also, saying yes to every possible invitation, which leads to whole chunks of days and evenings going into what actually we didn't put before the Lord. The correct answer when invited by somebody just like that, off the cuff or on the phone, to something, 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 would be perhaps, if it's a Christian, we can say, can I bring that to prayer? I want to bring that to the Lord. Or one can say neutrally, I just think about that for a few moments or a few days and then I'll come back to you. In other words, we don't have to answer straight away. And the difference is this, it gives the Lord a chance to decide. Otherwise, we'll always be saying yes. I've told you before that they say that Father Michael Ross died of saying yes. Always saying yes, and so generous that time was going. Time was going, time was going. We don't have to do everything possible. Now, holiness, it's actually not an abstract thing. I remember our abbot at one time saying when one went into choir, into the liturgy, one was not going there to go into cloud cuckoo land. That was his very expression. And he was trying to warn us about the practicality of sanctity. It happens also that charity has to be expressed even in liturgy and also in the delicacy of singing correctly and well. It's all practical. Holiness is very practical. If one is a heavyweight to live with, there's something of an illusion in that person's sanctity. Sanctity is actually healing. It's not drawing attention to itself. A person who is, as it were, visibly holy might not be so holy as we think. A person who's actually good company but never damages anybody in charity might be genuinely holy, especially if that person secretly helps a lot. And those little victories that no one sees, e.g. not showing impatience, these are real tests. Holiness is essentially the transmission of the life of the Trinity to others around us, and that life is warmth, heat and healing. And piety. Now, piety has two roots. Pietas, in the eyes of the ancient Latins, applied to both the son with regard to his parents, filial piety, and also with regard to the creature's duties vis-à-vis the gods in those days. So that has come through to us, and in our context, Trinitarian worship is valid. We handle God well. That's why to bring into the house of God and the liturgy of God the other, the jovial, the human-centered, the applause of man, is not pious. It's actually a fault against this virtue of piety. We have to give God his rights. That means handling God not as a mate and expecting him to follow, but as our creator and judge. And that has a certain consequence in practice. In fear and trembling, we come to someone higher than ourselves. It's a different attitude. And by the way, I can transmit to you quite a few echoes that I've received, that people coming for the first time to the Latin Mass do pick it up because of the shock. when compared with what they're coming from, they somehow know, well actually, this somehow is the real thing. So let's be aware of that. A lot of the people coming, you've noticed, on a Sunday, would not be coming necessarily from a desire for Latin, but from simply a desire to be nourished and to meet God without man in the midst. And they come back. Why? Somehow they found what the soul needs. And the soul, if it's authentic, needs depth, not the superficiality of what is actually an imitation of the world.